Bix tells Cassian that she has to leave, that her presence makes it harder for him to become who he's meant to be.
We have to beat them. And I believe you have purpose in making that happen. I need to believe that. So I'm choosing for the both of us.
It's a beautifully acted scene and even brings me to tears. But it's also a painfully familiar and traditional way to write a woman lead, as needing to step aside for the man's heroic destiny because she's a distraction. Her love and the family that she represents to him become an obstacle, a distraction from his higher purpose. She becomes the one who says, "You have to go on without me." And outside of one more scene, after this moment, the show doesn't return to her. She disappears, her sacrifice absorbed into Cassian's pain and narrative.
Once she goes to the fortune teller, she realizes that she kind of might be right, that Cassian is destined for more, and that he has everything in his own power to make real difference and to make real change. And when we have that scene where he tells me, I quit. I want to just sort of be with you, and I just want a normal life. I'm done. I think Vix really realizes that, she's going to hold him back. And it's a great sacrifice for someone to be like, I want this for us, but you are destined for the greater good.
I don't mind Cassian struggling with having to keep fighting. That's a real struggle, believe me. It's one I feel every day right now. I mind that the narrative makes it that Bix is the thing that he has to lose in order to become a hero. She deserved more than to be a stepping stone. Instead, all we get of her at the end is the final shot of the series, which reveals that Bix was pregnant all along, having given birth off-screen, left standing in an Elysian wheat field of Minao Rao, gazing into the distance, while Cassian rides off towards his supposed destined death in Rogue One. And in doing so, she becomes the visual embodiment of idyllic pastoral femininity, the sunrise that Cassian will never get to see, the symbol of hope that he fought for but will never reach. And some argue that this final shot, importantly, reframes her choice to leave Cassian not as a rejection of Cassian or for his destiny, but as a choice on her own part to protect her child. And Tony Gilroy argues this himself.
The final shot was, for anybody who is confused about Bix leaving Cassian in 9, it's a very sophisticated rationale for leaving. I mean, how do you react if you feel like you're living with someone who has a destiny and you might be confusing that destiny? That's a pretty subtle thing. And this underlines that and says, oh my God, she was pregnant when she was doing that.
But Gilroy's wording here reveals a lot. The pregnancy was meant to retroactively underscore Bix's departure, something to help people feel less confused, to make it more obvious. A kid apparently makes it easier, simpler, than her sophisticated rationale for why she leaves Cassian. The pregnancy wasn't originally part of Bix's decision, it was added later, a narrative patch meant to reframe her exit as a personal choice and something easier for audiences to understand, rather than it seeming like a byproduct of Cassian's male-centered hero's journey, which means that the show fully intended to end on the note that Bix left Cassian because she risked distracting him from his masculine, action-driven, destined path. It retroactively grants her agency while still reinforcing Cassian's arc. And that choice, shaped by a predominantly male writer's room and directors lacking women's perspectives, revealed a gap in how her story was told. Yes, Gilroy included that final scene, but can we really call it Bix's agency when it was constructed just to justify her absence, not to center her voice? The scene could have worked, but the problem lies in its context. We never hear from Bix about wanting a child, what that child would have meant to her or means to her. It's just a visual cue, an image we're meant to read as profound without her voice in guiding us to what it means to her. It would have worked much better if we had cut to her covered in dirt, working as an engineer for the rebellion or on Minao Rao itself, pregnant or not, with a kid or not. It would have grounded her choice to leave Cassian in some sense of continuity and agency and personal choice. But throughout the season, Bix has been a casualty of the narrative's condensation, her arc often yielding to the needs of Cassian's or the other characters. It's also strange that Bix's story ends on Minao Rao, a place that is primarily associated, at least on screen, with her sexual assault. While it's definitely likely that Bix has other memories that she made there, the narrative never shows them to us. So tying her potential future as well as her motherhood to that setting feels unsettling. It's like how the ending of The Rise of Skywalker thought it was profound that Rey buried Leia's lightsaber on Tatooine, a planet where her most notable connection was being enslaved on it. These choices lean on lineage symbolism without considering the trauma those places actually represent for these women within the narrative, mainly focusing on what these places meant for the men involved, be it Luke or Cassian. Instead, she's reduced to a final image of passive, idyllic femininity, standing in a wheat field with the camera lingering on her almost fetishistically. A visual fantasy of patriarchal perfection, a woman softened, naturalized, removed from the violence of resistance, standing in pastoral femininity as a sort of reward. This is underscored by the fact that the final image is both juxtaposed with Cassian leaving Yavin to go to Rogue One, and also visually mirrors Cassian's own death in Rogue One, a poetic visual inverse where he dies for the rebellion while Bix nurtures his biological legacy. Gilroy even admitted this.
The scene makes Cassian's sacrifice in Rogue just that much more epically painful, the child he'll never see. I was desperate to end on a hopeful note. Rebellions are built on hope isn't just a t-shirt, it's a legit flame.
To be fair, I think the hope that Gilroy intends here is meant to reflect what we saw earlier in Mino Rau, a world of collective care that Cassian and Bix have dreamed of, now made real for her and their child. The kind of community that the rebellion is supposedly fighting to protect. But again, we never hear about what that means to Bix. Her story is framed only as contrast to Cassian's death and his loss. And that framing seems to build upon the assumption that his death is more tragic not because he died for a future, but because he lost the supposed reward, a heterosexual family. The tragedy then becomes that he never got to retire into pastoral fantasy, where biological reproduction becomes the ultimate measure of worth and legacy. Yes, Cassian deserved a life. He deserved love. He deserved a family. He deserved not to die on Scarif. His death was gutting, but it wasn't meaningless without a biological child there. It mattered regardless. But Andor leans on a traditional shorthand to code that loss. Not through showing us the community he built or the galaxy he helped save, but through the child he never met and the heterosexual family he never seemed to vocalize wanting. It's a very specific image that he never voiced wanting, yet the show frames it as a natural thing he must have wanted. Yes, he did say he wanted a life with Bix, but we're never told he wanted to become a father. That desire is assumed, mapped onto him by our cultural expectation, a narrative shortcut built on heterosexual norms of our society today. It's a visual shorthand that our society often uses, rooted in patriarchal imagery for pastoral femininity. And it also gives this subtle implication that because Cassian had a child, it somehow makes it better. His story lives on. It's a hollow biological marker of legacy. It reduces everything he fought for to bloodlines, not solidarity, not memory, not cultural resistance. A visual of a brick laid on Ferrix and his name would have said so much more to me, meant so much more based on the context of a show rather than a child. It would have shown that his legacy was in the people that he fought for, the culture that he held on to, not a child he never seemed to seek. Instead, we get patriarchal myth-making, the woman in the wheat field, fertile with a legacy the man will never return to plow. I've heard people argue that this was Bix's agency on display here, but most people won't read Bix's pregnancy as a symbol of her survival or her agency. They'll see it as a vehicle to continue Cassian's bloodline as well as underscore his tragedy. A consolation prize meant to comfort the audience with at least the fact that his legacy lives on in his child. Fandom has already latched onto that. Theories abound that Cassian's kid might be Poe Dameron or show up in Star Wars Starfighter or whatever spin-off Disney drums up next. We just broke free of the Skywalker saga, only to race back into venerating bloodlines. Sci-fi franchises keep doing this, doubling down on biological legacy. Star Trek Picard Season 3 did the same, obsessing over children as the final mark of meaning for characters like Picard, a man who never seemed interested in parenthood, and in fact seemed rather relieved that he didn't have to be a parent, as his brother had a child, so he didn't feel responsible for having to keep his family's reproductive biological lineage going on.
And when Robert married and he had a son,
You felt it was no longer your responsibility to carry on the family line.
right. Yes, that's it exactly.
It's emblematic of how deeply our broader culture fetishizes bloodlines as the pinnacle of legacy, that we need to constantly replicate ourselves through having babies. I hope we never see this child again, but given Disney's track record and relentless appetite for IP expansion, I doubt we'll be so lucky. Even Tony Gilroy himself said,
Let's be honest, Disney owns that child.
and if that child should return, as much as I want to believe that Bix's Phyrexian culture and revolutionary spirit will be the thing that will shape that child's story, I can't shake the feeling that Disney will probably center it around Cassian's legacy. The kid looking at images of their dead father and wondering what they could have had and maybe aspiring to be like him, just like their dad. I can even write a scene for you. I bet you the kid will be about to run off to adventure but be unsure about it, and Bix will come into their room, sit down next to them and said, you know, your father would have done it. And then the next scene is them flying off to whatever adventure that movie's gonna be. It's not like Star Wars hasn't done this before. Revenge of the Sith reduced my absolute favorite Padme Amidala, once a queen and also a senator, to mostly a vessel for the Skywalker twins. Her political power, her fire, her intelligence, all were stripped away to make room for motherhood. The Rise of Skywalker repeats the same pattern. Rey's entire arc collapses into bloodline politics, casting her as a Palpatine who only chooses at the end the name Skywalker, undercutting The Last Jedi's radical message that legacy is more than genetics.
Rey Skywalker.
Bix's pregnancy falls into very much the same trap, a deep and interesting woman character flattened into a symbol of male legacy. This is what queer theorists like Lee Edelman have called reproductive futurism, a culture obsessed with children as the only meaningful future. In that framework, everything different, queer bodies, queer politics, radical refusal, is cast as selfish, antisocial, and a threat to continuity. Choosing not to continually replicate yourself, which many queer people do, is seen as a threat to social order. And that's the unspoken logic behind an ending like this. The idea that Cassian's sacrifice is made meaningful because it protects a child, and that he got to have a child. The fulfillment of a larger cultural fantasy. And Andor, for all its brilliance in exposing systemic violence, falls into that trap, the same biases that our culture builds itself on. That final image of Bix, fertile, quiet, pastoral, echoes fascist visual tropes of idealized femininity. It's a tableau with deep roots in eugenics propaganda that we can see in literal Nazi and especially fascist Italy propaganda that showed women often surrounded in wheat fields, fertile mothers helping fertilize the land and the bearers of the fascist nation's future. Fertile, domestic, pastoral, and mothers, while men waged heroic wars for the state. The similarity with the shot of Bix to these images is deeply uncomfortable. To be clear, this isn't to accuse Andor of supporting fascist imagery, but rather to recognize how this final shot draws from a broader Western visual grammar steeped in eugenics and colonial logics that fascism builds itself out of as self-evident. By placing a woman of color into a frame historically used to uphold racial purity and gendered submission without critique or subversion, the show inadvertently reproduces the aesthetics of a violently exclusionary future, the same future of replication of the present that systems of power always try to feed us. That we can only make a future that is the same as the past, a restoration of order, of what came before, of what we know to inherently be true. This supposed self-evident logic is used to erase the past to say everything has always been this way, and it argues that women don't belong in action. They're meant to be passive domestic vessels for reproduction in order to continue civilization, or else it will collapse. It's the same fascist logic weaponized today through things like anti-trans propaganda, but ultimately being used to control women and force them into roles that uphold endless reproductive futurism, repeating the same oppressive society over and over again.
I think everything is built on biology, on nature, and gender roles are a function of nature. And I think if you scramble that, if you confuse that, if you convince people that there's no difference between men and women, like that's when civilization falls. Then you have like women fighting your wars.
Being a fighter for the rebellion and being a mom are not mutually exclusive ideas. The show gestures towards hope, towards survival, but uses the oldest visual shorthand to do it. Motherhood is destiny, femininity is fertility, the future as a child. It's the kind of image Empire thrives upon. Hope imagined as obedience, life reduced to biological throughline. But rebellion was never about serving the next generation for its own sake. It was about refusing the logic that tells us whose lives are worth preserving and why. And yet, it's important to recognize that people are always carving out spaces within these narratives anyways. We always find ourselves. Women of color, for example, and shout out to this Blue Sky user, have reframed Bix's ending not as an acquiescence to heteropatriarchal futurism, but as an act of anti-colonial resistance. Historically, the weaponization of reproductive violence has been used to erase numerous marginalized cultures. In the US alone, over 70,000 indigenous women were sterilized just in the 1970s. Over 2,000 Mexican-American women in California were sterilized during that same decade as well. Puerto Rican women, like the lineage of Adira Adrona, who plays Bix, were sterilized en masse by the US government throughout our history. These programs directly inspired Nazi Germany's programs, even if many historians often try to hide that connection. Today, in Gaza, 70% of the reported dead are women and children, and thousands of pregnant women are giving birth in unsafe, often lethal conditions. There are multiple eyewitness accounts of pregnant women being killed by Israeli soldiers, including while trying to access health care. In that context, raising a child within your culture becomes an act of defiance. Not reproduction as bloodline, but as survival. Not to serve empire, but to defy erasure. In that framing, Bix's choice isn't passive or patriarchal or reproductive futurism, it's revolutionary. It may not be the show's intention, it may not be what most people will read out of it, but it's a reading we can claim. Reclaiming that image, reclaiming Bix's story, is a refusal to let empire decide what survival looks like. As a trans woman, I spent my life finding fragments of myself in other people's stories, because our culture will always find space and empathy for men like Cyril. We'll build whole arcs around their potential, their almost redemption. We treat their pain as profound. Meanwhile, people like Cinta or Bix, queer, brown, principled from the start, get treated like obstacles or afterthoughts. But that can change. And it starts by reframing what legacy we believe we're a part of. On Yavin, we still see resistance in its quiet forms, in new futures. Willman still thriving, getting all the girls after having an injury that left him disabled. Val and Mon finally eating together openly among friends, not stuck in their upper-class high-rise apartment having to code everything they say in whispers. Clea smiling earnestly for the first time in the show. Moments with Cassian laughing with Melshi and K2SO. Not destiny, not blood, just people choosing each other. Finding found family, not an image of a traditional one. Not legacy through children, but through community, through the bonds we build, through the stories we reclaim from the systems that try to define us. Because rebellion isn't about preserving bloodlines, it's about breaking the story that says they're all that matters. It's not about saying all that we can do is endlessly replicate the same ideas, the same systems, the same powers into the future, endlessly repeating as a cycle. And when we remember that, when we tell our own stories, messy, communal, defiantly alive, we build something more lasting than any bloodline. We build up each other, and we become the future no empire could plan for.